Welcome back, everyone. I am Cass Piancey, and I am here as usual with my partner in crime, Bennett Tomlin. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Cass. How are you?
I'm doing good. We are joined today by Oliver Beige, who is an industrial engineer turned economist who got his PhD at Berkeley to explore the internet and some of its aspects. How are you, Oliver?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to speak with you, and we had no subject necessarily in mind when I reached out. So you suggested we discuss cryptocurrency and how it has sort of lent itself to tribalism. Can you open that discussion for me?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, this is a bit of a staple topic I'd like to talk about a lot, but it's basically, as I said, like my background is industrial engineering, so like talking about inside the firm. But I moved to the United States in '95 when this new thing was happening, the internet, and I decided, okay, I wanted to study this, and I wanted to study it from the other side, basically from the market side. And so I did a PhD, but in economics, but also at the business school. So I'm always like in between the two sides. But my key interest was really sort of like in the emerging network competition that the internet enabled. And the orthodox view at the time was really sort of, if you have positive network effects in any kind of networks, and back then we were talking about like telecom networks much more than the internet, or typewriters, all these famous examples, VHS versus beta. As soon as you have positive network effects, you have a monopoly outcome. And I come from like a graph theory, network theory background. Of course, a network typically has a structure, and sort of basically both the engineering orthodoxy and the economic orthodoxy just basically assume the structure of the network away. And I was like, okay, what's going to happen if I actually look at the network structure, see how the network structure affects outcomes within a network competition or network technology adoption. And sort of my point was very much this is the monopoly outcome, which you get like VHS versus beta wins, or the famous like QWERTY versus the Georgia keyboard. The QWERTY wins even though it's the worst technology standard. It's not really true. You have, in most cases, you have multiple outcomes, you multiple surviving technologies, and like once and from that point on, the question becomes, if you have a network with a structure and the network is in some way too big, how does it break into multiple parts? Like, where does it fall apart? And it's like, from an economic perspective, is the outcome of this network falling apart, is that it like economically efficient? And once you see things from that angle, you'll start like seeing so many cases where we have positive network effects and we still have multiple outcomes. And the most obvious ones are like languages. We've seen over the last, a couple thousand years that the number of languages in the world has gone down, but we still have, 5,000 different languages. And then we like do something much more recent is very similar is programming languages, right? So we all want to like learn the same language because that makes much easier. It would be much better if like every single piece of software was written in the same language. But of course, we have a proliferation of programming languages. So like more like new languages being developed all the time. So we're not going down to like the one final programming language in the world. So you have like the two effects going in both directions, in like sort of concentrating into like one, but also you have going in multiple different directions. So basically, you have the two things you have normally within a group. You have goal conflict. You want different things, people, and you basically have the network structure. We have interactions that are more intense between people, between peers. And you have interactions that are less intense or no interaction at all. And you also have like the positive and the negative interactions. And so like basically I'm starting to become known within the crypto world is very much, I think I sort of like contradicted Vitalik when he was basically posting on network effects or like creating monopoly outcomes. So no, it's not the case. And of course, that's a message that resonates with the Ethereum community because sort of they're defending themselves against the claims of Bitcoin maximalists that Bitcoin will be the one that's ultimately winning out.
It's an interesting proposition. One of the examples you used was language. And I think that's a really interesting and good example because while I only know English and I can understand a tiny bit of Spanish. Meanwhile, I guess I don't know if this is still true or not, the most spoken language in the world, at least when I was a kid, was Mandarin, actually. But the problem with Mandarin was that, one, it is almost exclusively spoken on the Chinese mainland, which is a very singular entity. It's not like English, which is spoken throughout the entire world. And then also the second issue with that is that they actually rely on the English language to type in their language. The Pinyin is how they're typing things. And so therefore they have to learn English to even be able to communicate in Mandarin these days. And that feels like the monopoly for English, for the English language, growing significantly stronger, even in this short amount of time. Do you think that's incorrect, or do you think that's true?
Do you expect that the English will become the monopoly language in the world within, I don't know, a foreseeable time? Couple hundred years. So we have intense global financial interaction. We see all the problems with global supply chains now. We have global sourcing in many industries. But are we expecting that we're going to go down to a single language because it's the most economically efficient thing, or are we going to go down to maybe a couple hundred languages?
What do you think would be the outcome?
So what I expect is two things that more people will learn two or maybe more languages. It's becoming normal. It's it's very possible as the English is becoming the predominant second language. But I see no reason why we should have within the next future English beating out Mandarin or English beating out Spanish, because you can even without with only one language, you can do quite a lot of most of your social and financial interaction with just speaking one language. The other thing is, of course, we're gonna get technology that helps us translate much quicker. Yeah.
And I think that kind of connects back to what you were saying in the opening, that one of the things that prevents the monopolizing effect of just the general positive network effect is orientation towards different goals. So it seems plausible that something like English would become the go-to language for most people who intend to conduct international business, but that many other places may have a desire to preserve their natural language for purposes of history, national identity, or other things like that.
That's where I'm looking, though, also, and I see that a strong sense of globalization in general, and you can view that in a negative way if you want to, but I generally see the idea of global communication as being a good thing, but also being something where, you're talking about, everyone understands English. It's their second language. It isn't necessarily the one they're using primarily, but then if you are spending most of your adult life communicating with people who only speak or who rely on English in general to conduct business, it just seems more and more to me like you are relying less and less on every other language.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, you've seen cases like that. Basically in India, it's also lingua franca. You have situations for instance in Ireland, which more or less made this switch that almost everyone in Ireland is speaking English now. So you have this not always friendly influence that sort of gets part of the population to switch. We have if you actually go back in history and look at countries like France, French. The French we know today was the language of the Ile-de-France, the area in Paris, but sort of in southern France they would speak Languedoc. In Alsace they would speak German. In Brittany they would speak Breton. So you have 15 whatever different languages and dialects. And of course, like partly sort of the French government, centralized French government was pushing for like sort of everyone speaking the same language. And so you have this process, like minimization of communication standards, which a language is. And the more interaction you have, the more you have this pressure. But this does not by itself sort of like preordain that the ultimate outcome will be a single language. You still have, at any point in time, you have, as I said, enough people within your social network, like people who don't even speak English, people who don't want to speak English, people who speak English poorly. So you're much better off speaking in your native language. And if you're Mandarin Chinese, I don't know what the number is, like 700 million or something. That's quite a few people to talk to, right? So even if you don't speak a single word of English. So, and of course, like sort of, as I said, the mechanism, the more connections we have within the network and the more homogeneous these connections are, the more likely we'll see monopoly outcome. But once you have goal conflict, you have a network structure that matches the goal conflict or the various goals. And you have a sort of loosely connected network, then you get multiple outcomes. This is sort of like, in a nutshell, sort of the things I was interested in before I started like thinking about like crypto at all. But it's sort of like it sort of matched the discussion at the point, and you're not only having sort of like the discussion Bitcoin and Ethereum, but you also have like multiple protocols within Bitcoin that were competing for attention.
So looking specifically at cryptocurrencies, what factors do you see that contribute to it not being a monopolizing network effect? Like what are the goal conflicts or structural details that tend to prevent that from occurring in cryptocurrency?
A lot of it is actually attitudinal. I think very sort of like the Ethereum community is very different from the Bitcoin community. It's also like been different from Zcash communities and others. But also they like started to have from a little bit of a different purpose to realizing that they're actually doing very, very different things, right? Bitcoin tries to be a base layer currency, global currency, and sort of I call it Ethereum is sort of like an SAP system for the enterprise world. So they're basically connecting on much more ambitious goals. And at the point we are now, makes more sense like to keep them separate.
So let's not use language this time. Instead, like you were talking about telecoms, for instance, before. I mean, we pretty much saw a near complete monopolization of telecoms. They were forced to break up, but now there's at least an oligopoly. I think we can all agree on. Like it's AT&T and Verizon in America, and so I just wonder if that points to the idea that there's, instead of it being even that it's a goal-oriented thing, because I think all the telecoms had nearly the same goals, which was just to have more customers, right? I mean, I don't know what Verizon is doing different than AT&T. They're building the same infrastructure out and fighting for the same exact customers. So is it sometimes just a matter of like breaking up only to come back together again? Like I guess I see it in industry often being a little bit different than something as fluid as language, where like you can actually have physical barriers, right? Like the reason people in England started speaking a different language is they were on an island. And so I wonder if those different goals and this ability to create that separation is getting lost as things speed up with tech.
So the telecom is a pretty good example, because sort of like when the Bell system was created, when the original Bell was broken up, it was broken up into geography, and you are bringing geography into play now. And I think we had 7 from memory. We had seven local baby bells. And that was pretty stable for quite some time, largely because at the time, most interaction via telephone was local, or at least regional. So it made a lot of sense. There was no particular reason to do something about that. I think when I was moved to US, so probably like mid '90s, early 2000, they started like to merge, largely driven because that business became not only like more like countrywide, but it also became global. Sort of like the emergence of global sourcing and like stretched out supply chains really like played into that. I don't know, of course.
And it was also deregulated at that point as well. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But so I think they were from memory. It's been a while. So were able to merge before they realized that it might make business sense to do that. So you have, as I said, like the more interaction you have, the more global interaction, more like flat interaction you have, the more likely you see like number of networks going down. And of course there are of course cases where we have a monopoly outcome. Yeah. Basically we cannot rule it out. We could have like at one point we could have one global cryptocurrency, very possible. Of course, we could also have zero global currencies. This is still an open question, but sort of my hunch, from my understanding of how sort of the market structure looks like, is technology structures look like it's much more likely that we have multiple. It's because they're trying to solve different problems, and they will more and more go in the direction of focusing on the problems they're able to solve.
So related to that, do you kind of expect there to be basically a winner takes nearly all in like a specific goal direction? So for example, perhaps Bitcoin becomes this universal global currency, whereas Ethereum eventually takes over the vast majority of all the smart contract cryptocurrencies because it is able to combine the positive network effect with that specific goal? Or is there some other dynamic in the way these cryptocurrency communities are set up that would make that unlikely?
Yeah, this brings us back to like the original conversation Cass and I had about like the role of geography, right? So cryptocurrency is by design a global structure. It was one of the key original advantages it have, that is sort of unlike payment systems back then, which were completely like localized. You had a global design of a global system. So you basically had something that would be able to supersede geographic and political boundaries. And sort of, if you take that away, if you take geography away, what's left? It's basically, as I said, tribalism, people believing in certain narratives, people believing in certain counterfactuals, and would be the social dimension, and the economic dimension is that they target different use cases. And we see both basically right now in terms of like people have very, very strong beliefs about where the whole cryptocurrency and blockchain world is going to go. And of course, this is typical in like very new technologies.
But for now, do you see the main tribalistic tendencies as just being kind of, as opposed to dramatically different goals or necessarily use cases? And while that may be the case for, let's say, Bitcoin and Ethereum, there are thousands and thousands of these cryptocurrencies, right? Do you think it is just mostly attitude and kind of, is it a more ethereal concept of the differences between these communities?
In part, I mean, sort of you have on one hand like tokens that are competing to become like dominant cryptocurrencies, and then you have like many tokens that that can be like much more usefully compared to equity in a company. So you use them in order to deal with the product this company puts out. So and I don't have a problem that there's like, I don't know, 300 different tokens. Very much like most of those tokens are tied to particular value proposition. I like to call this the problem of buying a Coke from the Coke machine with Coke shares, which is sort of a strange thing, but of course, like, it could be technically possible. And sort of the effect would be that, like, if the shares in Coca-Cola goes down, Coke gets cheaper, which is pretty weird idea, but and
really bad for Coca-Cola too. Like, it seems like it would be a bad spiral down.
If like code gets automatically cheaper, more people will buy it. So hopefully then the price will go up. This is the idea. Of course, the question is if that's actually like stable, or that's a dynamic that will like veer off in one of the two directions, like go nowhere. But of course, I remember .com boom. Every small startup, .com startup, was basically buying everything with equity. Like getting a haircut and offering equity because they didn't have any cash. Yeah.
One of the reasons I've been skeptical over the last several years of a winner-take-all cryptocurrency is in the nature of cryptocurrency governance, where often on certain foundational issues, the final option for the group who disagrees with the methods of the other is to basically fork the code base and start your own cryptocurrency. And so you repeatedly see this splintering into these separate pieces. Do you have any thoughts on the dynamics of like that type of governance, that type of forking, and its effect on the network effects for these cryptocurrencies?
Exactly, and this is what makes sort of basically consensus mechanisms such an intriguing thing. Is you have like these splintering of networks, like via goal conflict built into the design, right? So now we've seen this a couple times. I don't think we've seen a case where you have like a cryptocurrency being forked in two fairly equal parts. Like most of them, like there was like one that like predominated, but it could perfectly happen. And so like the goal is very much like what you don't see is like forking all the time, right? So I don't like this particular technical feature about this particular currency, so I'm gonna start a fork and like I'll do that every day. Right, this is not happening. So you need some sort of like coalitions to emerge. You need like very strong goal conflict to emerge to like see a cryptocurrency split in two. And then what we've seen so far, the normal case is that there's one that's dominated and the other one is sort of becoming a fringe currency. And this is very intriguing design. It's also a process that makes sure that we're probably not going to go to the single dominating cryptocurrency anytime soon. Yeah.
Oliver, I know you have some thoughts on the relationship between these type of mechanisms and the power of the state.
Exactly. One of like sort of been like looking at cryptocurrencies in like, I don't know, 2011, but like mid 2010s, like 15, 16, I remember like sort of I was working for an employer that asked me to write a little bit about like the economic perspective of cryptocurrency. And I'm like sort of, I think back then was like the only economist with some sort of academic economics background who was like actually mildly intrigued by the whole thing rather than not repulsed like many other prominent economists have very strong negative opinions about cryptocurrency. But like sort of like one of the questions I asked is sort of occur like if you actually imagining that a cryptocurrency would supersede the nation state, which is a common like popular claim. So like you just like play around with this idea that it will happen. And this is like when Cass and I had like a little discussion a couple weeks about this. Is sort of like how could this actually play out?
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, how would that play out?
I mean, the interesting thing, sort of, there is a precedent that says Robert Mandel's like work on optimal currency areas, which, like, if you're familiar with it, he's basically like considered one of the fathers of the euro, basically saying because a currency does not have to be attached to a single country. It could also like whatever have bigger role with multiple countries. And the only thing is you like the biggest thing you have like there's a couple of conditions he listed, and one of the big things is that basically you have to have the people within that community be willing to share the cost of mutual protections, right? And sort of like basically public goods we have like defense, internal order, protections against unemployment, protections and is against infectious diseases, what we've seen, protection against flood, and so on. This is all costly, and we have to have a mechanism, like bureaucratic mechanism, to pay for that. And this is like usually with taxations, and then a process that decides like which things we're willing to pay for those. Right? If you think this a little bit through, this is like, where do you see these situations? And it's typically like people who have shared geography, so like neighbors, very obviously, people who have a shared language. We'll have this discussion, and then people who have a shared religion. And this is like where the nation state comes from. Basically, a nation state is a geographic protection racket, right? Bureaucratized protection rackets. Like feudal states were not bureaucratized, so basically the king or biggest guy would just take any money he wanted to whatever, like pay for his military and pay for his endeavors. But like now we have, and I don't see anything within cryptocurrency that basically replicates that. So, but we still have to basically solve the problem of coming up with a way to provide those public goods.
I suppose that the libertarian counter to that would be that governance is unnecessary, sovereign citizen kind of like the idea of taxation, the idea of everyone agreeing to all of this stuff is opposed to and I'm not saying this because I don't think this is necessarily true, but is opposed to the idea of many of these cryptocurrencies. Do you think that there's facts to that, or?
I am in general a big fan of coming up with private ways to provide public goods. I think if we can do this, usually an improvement. Most public provision of public goods is very like inefficient, but a lot of sort of like this angle of, okay, we don't actually need like a governance structure that provides all these public goods, all those protections, comes from the assumption that any kind of economic interaction is voluntary. And if you look at economic textbooks, you don't really find a lot of talk about violence. That's not even like just libertarian. This is just basically standard academic textbooks. There's pretty much the assumption that like the economic interactions we have are voluntary. Where I come from is Berkeley. Is my field advisor is Oliver Williamson, who's like one of the big guys in institutional economics. He basically asks all those questions: what is a governance structure that makes sure that we can have financial interactions that are protected.
And for right now, I mean, probably not for much longer, but for right now, I would say that cash does a pretty damn like physical cash bills do a pretty great job of ensuring that privacy, right?
This is still, we still have to compete with Asperger, still by far the most private way to pay for that. Yep, it's also like the most peer-to-peer way to pay for that, because it's basically only relies on me looking at the bill or the coin and like deciding if that's the real one or counterfeit, right? So we don't have a like centralized mechanism that sort of oversees that transaction. If someone can actually replicate cash in a digital domain, that would be a big step forward, even beyond blockchain. As we can see, blockchain is a centralized structure. And it shows like the typical problems of a centralized structure is congestion. Every time there's a lot of action in any kind of currency, we have like congestion problems, and congestion problems are problems with a centralized network structure. Yeah.
You can't have congestion issues on a decentralized structure, is that?
Well, decentralized maze means basically you have multiple alternative routes towards compared to the like main road. Yeah.
But it could also be that those, I mean, like if I just think about a street, right? Like if there could be 100 different ways for me to get from my home to my studio, but like there's the freeway, which is always going to be the fast or the shortest route. But then
exactly
taking those other decentralized routes could still take me an hour and a half longer than it normally would, right?
This is one of the basic laws in transportation science. Yeah, I mean, there is a congestion level to the main road versus the alternative road, which basically at one point you're even if the main road is shorter, you're not faster because it's more congested. We're getting into the weeds of network and graph theory. Like basically all about like cut points. What happens if the main road gets cut off? Happened in like some minor cryptocurrencies a couple times. Like the situation we had until very recently is that most of mining was concentrated in like Bitcoin mining was concentrated in China. What happens if this bits gets captured by the Chinese state? I mean, it went a different route, but it's sort of like these are like fundamental graph theoretic problems, right? And this is where all the decentralization comes from. We want to have alternative routes, and we also ideally want to have alternatives when one major cryptocurrency gets congested. So, but as already, like there is no the whole cryptocurrency world like loves decentralization, but there is no like ideal decentralized structure. We also always have to find a balance between centralized and decentralized organization.
Which really further reinforces the point you opened in, basically that the social structures and stuff inherent in these things are going to make it difficult for the network effects to lead to a single winner take all, because there is no single ideal structure. It's a matter of degrees and what.
Maybe there is one. Maybe it's gonna take us another 100 years to find it. But it's sort of right now we're like sort of groping around and trying to figure out how this things can work. Yeah. Sort of if you're willing to take on a lot of conflict and a lot of drama, it's really kind of exciting thing to do. Yeah.
How do you perceive and handle that tribalism, right? I mean, it seems like, I mean, I wouldn't suggest you're in the trenches on like cryptocurrency Twitter getting in stupid arguments with people. You have managed to avoid that pretty well, it seems like. But as an outside observer of this, which I'm very guilty of it, and many of my friends are guilty of it as well. How do you perceive that, and what are your takeaways from that when you see it so intense?
Well, it's sort of like part of like my day-to-day job is to like track a lot of technologies that take another 10 to 20 years to the market. I was like very early in things like autonomous driving. This was mostly by happenstance or lots on neural networks and some other things. I was basically able to follow along for like 20, 30 years how these things evolved, right? And one of the things you have very early on is people like to take sides. And that's very simple, right? Because you have binary outcomes. It's going to work. It's not going to work, right? This is the simplest thing you can do with something that unfolds over a decade or more, right? We still have discussions about like if there's ever going to be autonomous vehicles, and this started like in the mid '80s. And my goal is always to like sort of realize that we cannot answer this question at the point of now, because stuff will like come along which we cannot quite foresee, and like so what I like to say is always sort of like any sort of those like sort of big new technologies from like inception to basically market dominance or something, they take like 3 to 5 miracles to get there. And a miracle is everything that is obvious in hindsight.
Like Amazon being like, we're going to not just sell books anymore. We'll sell other things too.
Yeah, no, like Amazon was like sort of like, yeah, we let others use our platform to sell their stuff. They're making money off like others selling on their platform. At the end, they sort of realize, okay, there's money to be made if you're actually giving others the opportunity. And that's like one of the miracles, right? The other miracle they had is EWS, of course. But all of these stuff, like you have these big ideas and you always have these like hype disappointment cycles. And I like usually in this stuff, you have multiple hype disappointment cycles. We had that in cryptocurrency a couple times already, and I like to call this like the drunk unicyclist. So like you're like veering from side to side rather than trying to like find this like the perfect path with like very very like subtle movements. You're basically moving from like one end to the other, and eventually will come out. And as I said, like my position is very much that I expect the technology to play a much bigger role than what the critics think, and I assume that the like whatever, if there's a financial infrastructure evolving from this, it will look much closer than what we have now, because sort of you can solve some trust problems with a crypto, but you sort of like the claim of the things we can solve with blockchain is still like very like over the top. And we'll figure out what we can do with it. And in my opinion, like for me, it's intriguing because what I've observed is that sort of value creation, which will happen like in 50s to 80s, if you want, like happen in companies, is moving more and more towards in between companies. Right, so we had two big developments. There was like the auction, and the other thing was the matching markets and platforms that really shifted value creation towards between enterprises. Right, so price finding got much better, and the other thing, you had global sourcing, you had global multi-tiered supply chains, and like my problems are always like usually dealing with those like trying to make connections between accounting entities, enterprises, right? And so this is why I'm kind of like overall quite optimistic about this whole thing. But of course, like you have to deal with a lot of bullshit. Sorry to use that word.
You're looking at blockchain as like a financial accounting global accounting solution. Is that how you?
It's in between accounting entities and accounting system. Yes, this is what I'm interested in.
Interesting. Yeah, because one of our good friends is an accountant, and I can't think of someone who hates blockchain more. Maybe, you know what? That's not fair. She doesn't hate blockchain. She thinks some of it is very cool, but also I don't think she thinks there's much value in accounting necessarily. Can you describe what you see that value prop as?
I possibly would probably disagree with her. Like, we have a conversation. Yeah, this is like we're very far away. And one of the things is, of course, like we're building an accounting system, and like sort of the fundamental transaction within any cryptocurrency and blockchain system is, of course, like the fundamental accounting transaction. Like I'm taking something off here and I'm writing it there as a debit and credit system, but very few people within the crypto sphere are willing to actually like deal with and try to understand what accounting does, which I think is a major impediment, right? You're building an accounting system, but you're not willing to do actually like deal with like, yeah, like everybody hates accounting, but I think it's like if you want to deal with that, well, if you want to come up with a transactional system, you have to understand what it does. And sort of might derail us because eventually you have to understand like what accounting does in terms of like basically protecting the value creation with an enterprise. And of course, if you want to move that beyond the enterprise to between enterprises, which is like a couple of orders of magnitude more complicated, then you have to like do the hard slog on actually opening an accounting book. Sorry.
And I think a lot of our probably most of our listeners are familiar with all of this stuff, but there's been so many accounting frauds that were, I mean, Enron was courtesy of some accounting fraud. We had WorldCom. It was like a scourge. But I think when I've spoken to accountants generally, like the big four to this day, it was the big eight back then, the big four now, they sound like they all have the same issues as they did back then. Like not a lot has changed.
Yeah, of course. I mean, biggest purpose of accounting is to reduce the opportunities for fraud. It will not solve fraud. It will basically make it a little bit more transparent for an outside investor to understand what's going on within the firm, like how is my money being spent on by the company executives. But of course, like accounting is a discipline that has rules, but it also has a lot of discretion. Sort of this is a fundamental thing within accounting, that you have human discretion, and human discretion is being controlled by, or should be controlled by, certain rules and obligations, and also like penalties if you're getting caught. It is by far not a perfect system, right? It's probably better than a world where we don't have it. And this is sort of like my goal of actually moving this idea of accountability within the enterprise to accountability within an economy. And like biggest problem I dealt with professionally is definitely the silo problem, that basically you have siloed accounting and transactional and supply chain databases that do not speak with each other. For me, blockchain might be like one of the pieces of the puzzle that can solve that problem. Yeah. But of course, you have to deal with the many potential fraud scenarios you have in the blockchain world too.
Yeah, which are numerous.
No, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, it has been a pleasure, Oliver. Thank you for
Same here.
Thank you for joining us. It's been illuminating for me, so I really appreciate it.